The taxi pulled up, not to the front door of my house, but to the edge of a meticulously manicured lawn I'd never seen before. A strange, perfect green I didn't recognize. 11 months. That's how long I'd been gone. Boots on dusty ground half a world away. Dreaming of this one moment. Walking up the gravel driveway to my little white cottage with the faded blue shutters. Maybe surprising my mom with an early return. And finally, just finally sleeping in my own bed. But when I stepped out, uniform and duffel bag heavy with the weight of that longing, all I saw was a literal fenced-in dog park where my living room used to be. I stood there frozen, the sun warm on my face but my gut turning to ice, watching a golden retriever leap for a frisbee right where my old porch swing should have been. A woman in yoga pants gave me a weird side-eye, scolding her poodle for sniffing my bag. Completely oblivious that she was standing on what was, for all intents and purposes, the last piece of my home. I thought I was at the wrong address, my mind scrambling, but then I saw it. The old oak tree, the one I'd carved my initials into before I deployed. Still standing, still scarred, still in my yard. Except my yard had been stolen. A shiny brand new sign stood where my mailbox used to be. It read, Evergreen Heights Community Park, sponsored by the Homeowners Association. Underneath it, a plaque with some cheesy quote about peaceful living and communal joy. I swear to you, my heart started pounding harder than any incoming mortar fire I'd ever heard. I cornered a couple walking by, sipping smoothies, and asked them what happened to the house. The guy just shrugged. So casual it made my blood run cold and said, oh, some government dude hadn't paid his taxes, so the HOA repurposed the land. They walked off, not a care in the world, not knowing that I was the so-called government dude they were talking about. And right then, something inside me didn't just snap, it shattered. It wasn't rage, not yet, just this hollow, disbelieving exhaustion. I'd faced down real bullets, led patrols through burning villages to pull people to safety, and now, back home, the enemy wore designer sunglasses and ran neighborhood committees. The next few hours were a blur, a Kafka-esque pinball game of city offices. The property records were a joke, a ghost in the machine. According to their system, I'd lost my land 6 months ago due to a supposed tax delinquency. But I had filed the military tax exemption paperwork myself before I left. The clerk, a young guy with a confused look, just told me to talk to the HOA. That's when I first heard her name, Brenda Hayes, president of Evergreen Heights. I found her in the community clubhouse, holding court like a queen with a glass of Pinot Noir, surrounded by self-awarded plaques and a huge blown-up portrait of herself titled, Founding Mother. She was in the middle of lecturing a teenager about her backyard fairy lights when I walked in. She didn't even look up until I cleared my throat, the sound of low thunder in the too quiet room. I introduced myself, said I used to own the property at 1142 Oakwood Drive. She blinked like I'd just insulted her interior decor. Then came the smirk, the infamous Brenda smirk. She flipped through a file and said, oh yes, that lot had gone unclaimed, delinquent, and was transferred to the HOA per subdivision protocol. When I tried to explain I was on active duty, that I had a federal exemption, she cut me off mid-sentence. And I'll never forget what she said, and I quote, maybe you should have thought of that before joining the army and abandoning your responsibilities. The air went so thick with her ego you could have heard a pin drop. I reminded her that federal law protected deployed service members from losing property. She just offered me a different lot, at the rear of the neighborhood near the dumpster area. We can work something out, soldier, she said, like she was doing me some huge favor. That night I didn't sleep. My body was home, but my soul was still on a different kind of battlefield. A much dirtier war. The next morning I called my old friend Leo. We served together, and I'd once pulled him from a burning convoy, so he owed me a favor. A big one. I told him everything, and within hours he was a ghost in public databases. What he found was a spider web of forged signatures, retroactive board meeting notes, and land sales involving shell companies linked to Brenda's cousin. The HOA had created a fake paper trail that looked legit on the surface, but collapsed under a magnifying glass. Leo even found emails between board members joking about how easy it was to flip that soldier's dirt, and how they planned to make the Neighborhood military-free and HOA pure. He sent me a screenshot of Brenda joking that I'd probably never come back, and if I did, I'd just salute and walk away. That was it. The rage I'd buried for so long finally started to rise like a storm tide. I thought about court, but Leo said legal battles could drag on for years, and Brenda had layers of protection. I needed something faster, something louder, something poetic. I remembered a conversation with Colonel Dawson from my last deployment. He'd said if I ever needed anything back home, I could call him directly. I never thought I'd actually cash that in. But this was different. This wasn't just a property dispute. This was a betrayal of a soldier by the very people he protected. I told him everything and he didn't laugh. He didn't hesitate. He just said, "Send me the GPS coordinates and a list of structures involved." Then he added, "You want this quiet or dramatic?" I replied with every ounce of dignity I had left. Dramatic. The plan was born right there in a whispered conversation over a secure line. I didn't want an apology. I didn't want compensation. I wanted the HOA to feel, publicly and permanently, what it was like to have their lives bulldozed overnight, just like they did to me. And in 3 weeks, they were about to learn exactly what that felt like. The next morning, while most of Evergreen Heights was watering their roses and filing petty complaints about grass height, I was already neck-deep in blueprints, drone images, and zoning maps with Leo. He'd built a case file so thick it could have served as a doorstop, with ownership records showing how the HOA had claimed adverse possession by falsely stating my property was abandoned. It was obvious now. They'd waited for me to leave, fabricated documents, forged signatures, and sold the land to a shell corporation owned by Brenda's cousin. It was theft wrapped in bureaucracy, and they thought because I was overseas I'd never be able to fight back. They were wrong. Leo pulled up satellite photos of the entire neighborhood from before and after my deployment. There were inconsistencies everywhere. Fencing, road expansion, and infrastructure that wasn't permitted by the county. Brenda had been expanding her little HOA kingdom illegally, and the more we looked, the more it became clear this wasn't just about my land. Several homes on the north side were built on what used to be protected wetlands. The utility shed near the dog park was built over a sewer easement. Even their fancy new clubhouse was technically half a foot into municipal land. That was enough for legal leverage, but I wanted more. I wanted a statement. I printed out an email Leo found, where Brenda boasted about her military deterrent strategy, calling soldiers unpredictable and undesirable homeowners. That one made my blood boil. I pinned it to my motel wall, right beside a grainy photo of my old house. I could still make out the rocking chair my mom gave me before she passed, the one she insisted I keep on the porch, so it felt like home even when I wasn't there. They'd probably just torn it apart with the rest of the house, tossed it in a landfill. My next stop was the courthouse. I had called in advance, and Judge Sterling, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had also served as a JAG officer, agreed to meet me. She looked at the forged documents and said flatly, "Someone is going to jail if this hits the media." But she also gave me a reality check. The HOA had money, lawyers, and influence. A legal victory might come, but it would be slow, dragged through appeals for years. When I asked her if there was any legal framework under which a federal entity could seize the area temporarily for investigation, her eyes lit up. She mentioned a specific type of federal oversight involving national security or public service abuse. I was already 10 steps ahead. I left the courthouse and called Colonel Dawson. When I explained the full scope of the HOA's fraud and how they mocked military families, his response was a sharp whistle followed by, "Well, damn. That's bold, even for HOA types." I laid out my plan, a military training exercise on civilian land in dispute. He said, "If the land is in question, and we present it as a simulation to evaluate urban conflict readiness or civil engineering, it could happen. Especially if the original owner, you, requests federal review and temporary assignment of the site." He said he'd talk to the brass and get back to me. It took less than 24 hours for him to confirm. The weekend-long training op was approved. He called it Operation Gavel Strike. It sounded like a joke, but it was deadly serious. My land and a large chunk of HOA-controlled property around it was now a live simulation zone for the 152nd Urban Training Battalion. They would roll in light vehicles, erect temporary structures, and simulate response scenarios for disaster management and property reclamation, all completely legal. Meanwhile, Brenda was completely unaware. She probably spent that week writing up new bylaws about mailbox height or wind chimes. Leo helped me map out the subdivision, identifying every structure that was part of the fraudulent expansion. The pool, the dog park, the clubhouse, even a few sidewalks that fell under contested space. The military was efficient. Within 3 days, they had satellite authorization, troop manifests, and material schedules. Everything was happening fast. I spent one last quiet night at the motel, looking at that photo of my old house. I remembered painting the porch with my sister, my mom in that rocking chair with a lemonade. They tried to erase it, but I was done letting them write the story. Starting now, I was taking the pen back. By the time the first military convoy rolled into Evergreen Heights, the neighborhood had no idea what was coming. Residents stood in their driveways in robes and slippers, confused and clutching coffee cups, while Humvees rumbled past their hydrangeas. I followed in an unmarked SUV, watching it unfold like the opening move of a chess match, a game I already knew the end of. The screech of tires and the hum of diesel engines echoed just as the sun began rising. Brenda Hayes stepped out of her house in a silk robe, carrying a mug that read Queen Bee of the Ridge. She blinked twice, completely unprepared for the sight of a military convoy parked right in front of her prize-winning hydrangeas. Camouflage tents were being erected in the park. Soldiers were hammering stakes into the ground, and uniformed men and women with maps and radios were walking all over the place, taking soil samples and scanning the land. Her perfect little suburb was suddenly the staging ground for what looked like an invasion. Her jaw dropped as a low-flying Black Hawk helicopter made a wide turn and hovered briefly over the dog park before heading to a nearby landing zone set. Up in what used to be the HOA's prized meditation, Garden Brenda marched across the lawn in outrage, waving her mug like it was a badge of authority, making a beeline for a tall officer. Before she could unleash her tirade, he calmly handed her a sealed packet. She yanked it open, her eyes scanning phrases like federal, assessment, land ownership investigation, and temporary occupation approved under joint operations. Protocol? Her face went from angry pink to a full-blown crimson. She started shouting about rights and neighborhood sovereignty, but no one was listening. I arrived 10 minutes later, stepping out of the SUV with quiet purpose. Brenda spotted me immediately and stormed toward me like a storm cloud in pearls. "You," she hissed. "You're behind this." I just nodded once and said, "That land you stole, it's coming back to me, piece by piece." Her hands trembled with fury as she pointed at the flags marking the borders of the contested properties. She tried to argue, but I reminded her that her entire subdivision was built on fraudulent claims and illegal zoning. I asked her when she last had her property lines inspected. She didn't answer. She demanded I remove the military immediately, or she'd call the mayor. I informed her the mayor had already approved the operation, and that Judge Sterling had personally signed off on the temporary seizure. The soldiers wasted no time. They established perimeters around the clubhouse, the pool, the community garden, all listed in our report as being on fraudulently acquired land. Brenda tried to barricade herself in the clubhouse, but the soldiers simply opened the door with a key provided by the county. Her precious community room was transformed into a command center. Her wine fridge was emptied to store water bottles and MREs. One particularly satisfying moment came when a young officer walked into Brenda's own house, took a few photos, and politely informed her that since it was on contested land, it would be used as the secondary field briefing site. Her living room was converted into a map room by noon. The residents were in full panic. Some waved protest signs scribbled on pizza boxes. Others called local news stations. A few angry dads tried to challenge the legality of the simulation. But once they were handed copies of the federal documents and reminded of the zoning violations buried in their own property records, they fell quiet. One older couple came over and offered me coffee. They'd lived here long before the HOA took over and confessed they always knew Brenda was shady. They'd been fined hundreds of dollars for trivial infractions like leaving a garden hose out. They even shared photos from when my house still stood. The media arrived that afternoon, and Brenda, trying to hold a press conference, fumbled through her statement, but her voice cracked when reporters asked why a veteran's home was bulldozed during his deployment. Footage of her losing her temper with a soldier went viral by dinner time. Hashtags like Justice for Jack and Bye Bye Brenda started trending. Leo kept feeding me updates. He'd traced another 5 homes in the subdivision to similar fake land transfers. It was an entire pattern of exploitation. By sunset, a massive red and white sign had been installed at the neighborhood's entrance. It read, "Federal Urban Training Ground, restricted access beyond this point." Brenda's empire of control was now occupied territory. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The next day, a uniformed officer stepped out of the clubhouse and placed an official letter on a folding table in front of Brenda. It was a notice from the Federal Land Review Board, stating that due to documented fraud, the entire Evergreen Heights HOA was now under legal audit and would cease all operations. Brenda tried to argue, but her voice was drowned out by the cheers of a group of neighbors who had waited for years to see her fall. Then came the final gift from Leo. Video footage from a closed-door HOA meeting, where Brenda openly mocked military personnel, called my property an eyesore, and bragged about bulldozing it while I was in combat. She laughed about how easy it was to manipulate land records and said the HOA would never be held accountable because people like me don't fight back once they're home. I forwarded it to the press with a simple statement. I'm home now. The footage went viral. Within hours, online platforms were flooded with calls for Brenda's arrest. The military issued official eviction notices to every resident who lived on property, built without legal authorization. A total of 11 homes, including Brenda's. The notice made it clear the homes themselves weren't being seized, but the land beneath them was now under federal scrutiny, and the owners were responsible for proving their titles were clean. Most couldn't. Her empire had crumbled. No more bylaws, no more petty fines, no more threats. It was all reduced to nothing more than caution tape and condemnation stickers. Brenda's lawyer dropped her as a client. Her cousin, the shell company operator, was subpoenaed. Even the contractor she used began cooperating with authorities to save himself. As night fell, I stood once more on the land that had been stolen. The soldiers had respectfully marked the original foundation. I stood there, letting the wind blow through the grass, remembering what was and what had been taken. But instead of bitterness, I felt something new. They started it with fraud. I was ending it with force. Not violence, not revenge, just undeniable justice. I wasn't even done yet. The military vehicles were packing up a few days later, but they left behind something far more permanent than their tire tracks. They left behind change. The neighborhood voted to form a voluntary civic association, not with fines and forced rules, but a group of actual neighbors supporting each other. They asked me to help draft the first charter. I declined the leadership, but I did agree to contribute a clause that protected veterans and active duty families from housing-related action without full federal review. They called it the Miller Clause. On a quiet afternoon, as reconstruction officially began, I placed a new wooden sign in the ground where my living room had been. Not a protest, not a threat, just a message. It read, "This land has been reclaimed with honor." A builder handed me a hammer and asked if I wanted to place the first nail. I did. I drove it into the frame of the porch, right where my mother's swing would hang again. The sound of it echoed, not as destruction, but as the beginning of something real. Weeks passed and progress continued. Brenda left town in the dead of night, her legacy reduced to memes and lawsuits. The neighborhood slowly healed. Kids played in yards again without fear of HOA spies writing down scooter violations. People planted what they wanted, painted what they liked, and smiled a little more. It wasn't perfect, but it was free. I never imagined the war I'd fight after deployment would be the one at home. I never expected the enemy would be someone with a clipboard instead of a weapon. But justice isn't about the size of the battlefield. It's about standing your ground when everything you own, everything you are, is under threat. They tried to bury me with paperwork, with fake signatures, with smug grins behind manicured lawns. They tried to erase my home like it was nothing more than a blemish. But they forgot something important. I was trained for resistance, for survival, for reclaiming ground 1 foot at a time. Now my house stands again. The porch swing is back, the flag waves high, and on warm evenings, neighbors drop by just to say hello. No agenda, no bylaws, just people as it should be. The war is over, and I won. Not with bullets, but with truth, with patience, with quiet power. They sold my land while I was deployed, so I came back and repossessed their entire world. But that's just my story. What do you think? Was my approach justified? Or did I go too far, creating a new kind of chaos in the name of justice? I've heard all the arguments, but I'm curious to hear your take. Let me know in the comments below. And if you've ever had a run-in with an HOA, share your story. Let's get a conversation started.